You may ask, why in the world are we starting this video with a picture of a proboscis monkey? I mean, after all, this thing is kind of homely looking, and this is a car channel, not a channel where we talk about animals. But I thought that it was highly appropriate to start this particular video on a 1969 Pontiac Parisienne with a photo of the proboscis monkey because, well, kind of the 1969 Pontiac and this monkey have a lot in common, especially when it comes to that flexible appendage or proboscis that you see on this monkey's head. And as we turn to this particular 1969 Pontiac Parisienne, you can kind of see why I started out with the proboscis monkey, because the 1969 Pontiac Parisienne that you see here has that flexible appendage style proboscis up front. Now, this really is an interesting time in Pontiac history, and that's because the Pontiac design team, as well as the engineers, introduced the Endura bumpers around this time, and probably most popularized by the 1968 GTO in the front end there. And the GTO had a complete Endura front end all the way around. But as you can see in 1969, only that midsection here was an Endura section on these particular vehicles. And the rest of the front end had this loop-style bumper, very similar to 1968, but here, the midsection is that flexible plastic known as Endura that was pretty exclusive to Pontiac during this time frame. I think it's a bit unfortunate because my guess is that the engineers wanted to tout that, and the marketing teams, that this car had that Endura front end and could absorb impacts, but oh my goodness, it endowed this vehicle with some interesting styling. More specifically, you have the Pontiac trademark arrowhead style hood, but it comes to a very distinctive point up front. And as we see, as we start to rotate around the car, that proboscis really just kind of sticks out there with respect to the overall vehicle. And I think it kind of looks a little funny. Remember, this was the era of the W-shaped front ends. This W certainly has a very elongated midsection as opposed to other W-shaped front ends. Let's rotate around to that front three-quarter view now. And unfortunately, this view makes that nose very prominent. And, well, that's just a distinguishing feature of these Pontiacs, shall we say. The interesting thing to me is that the design team that did the 1968 GTO, led by Bill Porter, was the same design team that designed this particular vehicle in Pontiac Studio, and it just doesn't quite have the elegance and grace of that 1968 GTO, nor even the 1968 Parisiennes. So 1969 for me in terms of the full-size Pontiacs is a bit of a lost year, but it's still an interesting year, especially this one that is a Parisienne. Now you'll notice a couple other traits about the styling here. There is some grace, particularly with that belt line and the fender peak. Notice how this fender peak just kind of starts dipping down as it approaches the door, and then the belt line swoops upward toward the rear quarter glass area. And you got a bit of the Coke bottle styling here with that kick-up that's aft of the door, as well as the body panel swelling outboard at the rear wheel. Now, the other thing you'll notice, if you take a look at this picture, take a look at the rear wheel and how far inboard it is on this car. That is not just, let's say, typical for the time, which it was, but it's exaggerated in this car because it's a Parisienne, which is the Canadian version of the upper-end Pontiac. And these Parisiennes rode atop a Chevrolet chassis. So while Pontiac was advertising the wide track in the United States, the Canadians and also export markets got the narrow track Pontiacs, like this Parisienne, that had not only the Chevrolet chassis, but also the running gear underhood, including V8 engines and other engines in some cases, even 6 cylinders within the full-size Pontiacs. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, because you could get some really interesting engine choices under hood, including, I'll show some pictures of a very special car. And as we look at the side view, you'll notice I think this is actually one of the most attractive views in this car, as well as the rear three-quarter view. And that's because of that beautiful, graceful belt line that just kind of undulates, goes down and then up and then back down. This car also has a beautiful taper to the rear end, something that General Motors designers, and in particular the styling leader, Bill Mitchell, were really a fan of. That kind of tapered front and or tapered rear was one of his signatures, and I think the Pontiac designers were really kowtowing to him with this vehicle. Now, the other interesting thing that you're going to see on this Parisienne is take a look in particular at the rear wheel and where it is centered. Does it look a little off to you? If it does, that's because it is. Remember, I mentioned that this car is riding atop a Chevrolet chassis. And what does that mean? Well, full-size Chevrolets during this era rode atop a 119-inch wheelbase. But the Pontiacs, the full-size Pontiacs, the short wheelbase Pontiacs like the Catalina had a 122-inch wheelbase. And then the Bonneville, as an example, the long wheelbase Pontiacs rode atop a 125-inch wheelbase. So long story short, the wheels are not centered in the wheel arches. And you can really tell that with the rear wheel here that looks like it's far too far forward. So if you got a Canadian market Parisienne or an export Parisienne, not only did you get wheels that were inset and kind of inboard with respect to the body, you got wheels that weren't even centered within the wheel arches on the body. And, it's amazing this was acceptable, but people bought them. The Parisienne was a great seller, and apparently they didn't care because it still looked good. And a lot of people, despite the fact that it looks funny in this picture, are often walking around the car and not just kind of taking a step back and looking at it. And I suppose it looks fine from that angle, but it just looks absolutely humorous to me when you take a look at it here. And it's even more exaggerated in this photo where the convertible top is up. Take a look again at that rear wheel placement. It's just humorous, absolutely humorous. Now, the rest of the car, like I said, in the side view, does look pretty good. I love the toothpicky A-pillars. Even the fact that this is a ragtop, it looks pretty attractive. But we'll rotate around now to the rear three-quarter view and take a look from that angle. And as you can see from this angle, which I think is also quite handsome, you have that tapered rear, and you have these tail lamps that kind of curl downward at the outer edges near the quarter panel. That look kind of started with the 1967 Pontiacs out back and continued on here. It would be gone by 1970. But it's a really nice look, I think, with you combine that with the tapered rear and the droopy, I'll call it droopy-eyed tail lamps in the back. And one more of the dead-on rear. Notice how designers were really trying to accentuate the width of the vehicle by having those tail lamps extend all the way to the outermost edges of the car, and also really not having much in terms of a quarter panel peak here. It's a pretty flat surface. The deck lid as well as the quarter panels are just flat with one another, and that gives you this kind of visual look of the car being wider because there's not a lot of ins and outs to the deck lid or the quarter panels. You just see the full width, again, accentuated by the tail lamps. But for those who are wondering, take a look at the bumper. You'll see these two little slots in the bottom of the bumper. What in the world are those? Those are not drain holes. It's actually where, if you had to jack the car up, you would put the jack in there. And, well, oftentimes you would distort that slot or something wouldn't quite look right after you jacked the car up and then put it back down. So don't use your bumper jack on these cars if you get a flat tire. You're best just to call a tow truck or AAA or something and then wait for somebody to help you and jack the tire up and change out that flat tire with your spare. Now, the badge on this car says 350 cubic inch and then V8, and that's because there's a Chevrolet V8 underhood in this car. In the U.S., if you got a Catalina, as an example, you had a 400 cubic inch V8 topped by a two-barrel carburetor as the standard equipment. You couldn't get a 350 in the big full-size Pontiacs. The 400 was standard. There was an optional 428 cubic inch V8. But again, here, because it's Canada, you could get smaller engines and the Chevrolet V8s under hood. And here is that Chevrolet V8 under hood in this Pontiac. And it looks strange, I know, but this is what they did over in Canada. Just a standard run-of-the-mill 350. It actually powers these cars very well. It powered full-size Chevrolets just fine on the other side of the border. But it is funny to me, sometimes you have these Chevrolet engines and they'll have a Pontiac decal on them. Or the Canadian Pontiacs have a different name for the Chevrolet V8s, like Astro Flash or something like that, as opposed to Turbo Fire that they had in the U.S. cars. But the interesting thing to me is in 1969, you could get not only this 350 in terms of the Parisiennes, but you could get all the way up to this 427 cubic inch V8 that's shown here. Now, the top 427 cubic inch engine was 390 horsepower. It's actually more horsepower than what you could get in the U.S. Pontiacs with the top 428 cubic inch V8. But like I said, you could get a 390 cubic inch 427. Interestingly, Pontiac in Canada called it the Astrojet V8. All the big block Chevrolet engines in the 69 Pontiacs were called Astrojets. You could get the 396. There were two 427 cubic inch variants, the 390 horsepower variant, and then a lower 335 horsepower variant. And if you got the small block Chevrolet, you had the Astro Flash V8. Ooh, the Astro Flash. But the Chevrolet engines in these, I think, just make them so cool. And unfortunately, these really haven't taken off with collectors yet. I mean, to some degree, but not to the degree that a similar Pontiac has in the U.S. And I think that's a shame because they're very rare cars and they're a neat part of automotive history. I would love to have a Parisienne equipped with a big block Chevrolet underhood someday. And just for reference, here's another big block equipped 1969 Pontiac. This is a Parisienne 2+2. 2+2, you say? What's going on here? I thought that ended in 1967. Well, it did in the United States, but it soldiered on for a few more model years in Canada. So yes, this is indeed a 1969 Parisienne 2+2 with a factory 427 cubic inch V8 underhood. How cool is that? If somebody has one in great shape to sell, 68, 69, whatever model year that you want, let me know. Email me, contact me, reach out. I would love to have one of these vehicles. Now, we'll finish with the interior, and I have to say that the interior of the latter 1960s General Motors cars just isn't quite the same as the mid and earlier 1960s GM cars, but still not horrible. Here you do have the fake wood grain, and you have it on the wheel as well as the instrument panel. I will say that take a look at that wheel as well as the shifter and the accelerator, the brake pedal, and the emergency brake pedal. Do those look like Pontiac components? Well, they're not. Those are Chevrolet components. That's the Chevrolet steering wheel and column, as well as the gear shift, and then the accelerator, brake, and emergency brake pedal. Because, as you know by now, these vehicles did employ quite a few Chevrolet components within them. And you have that Pontiac logo in the middle of the Chevrolet wheel. Kind of humorous to me that they're trying to disguise the Chevrolet wheel, but it is what it is. Now, unfortunately, on your Pontiacs in 1969, you didn't have much in the way of gauges. You had a lot of idiot lights. You can see off to the left there, temperature, oil, alternator are now a idiot light under the banner of systems. Ooh. So I guess that's the systems monitor. This car does not have air conditioning. You can just see it has a heater control over there to the right of the steering wheel. And I should say that in a number of these, and I can't quite detect the shift quadrant here, but you could get a Power Glide automatic even in your Pontiac from Canada. This one actually appears to say PRNDSL. It's a little hard to read, but in that case, it's a turbo hydromatic and not the Power Glide. The Power Glide would soldier on for many, many years just as this low-priced automatic. It was interesting, Chevrolet stuck with that two-speed automatic for so many years, and Ford abandoned it long before on many of its full-size vehicles in particular. But that was one of the reasons that there were some differences between the brands back in the day. And we'll close out with a picture of the back seat. It appears somebody has added rear seat speakers, unfortunately. Why do people cut up the trim panels to put these awful speakers in their vehicles, especially a convertible? You're going to have a lot of wind noise anyway, especially with the top down. It's just unfortunate because you can't find those trim panels anymore. They're just unobtainium. But I put a picture of this back seat because you can see this is a full-size car, but it's relatively tight back there, both in terms of width as well as leg room. So while a lot of people think of these as big full-size convertibles, and they are, well, the rear seat space maybe leaves a little bit to be desired. But hey, you can't have everything. At least you got to cruise around in the convertible if you were in the back seat and didn't have to walk home. So what are your thoughts on this oddball 1969 Pontiac Parisienne convertible? And in particular, the car that I showed, the 2+2 with the 427 cubic inch V8. I think that is awesome. Like I said, I would love to have one of those. I think that they only sold maybe a couple hundred or so each year of those big blocks with the high-end big block, 390 horsepower V8 in Canada each year. Gas was always expensive, relatively speaking, in Canada as compared to the United States. And so many people often didn't elect to get the big engine, even if it was not necessarily costly. As a consequence, they are very rare, but cool indeed. Thanks again for watching.